There are moments in the grand, sprawling narrative of human history when the future pivots on a single, silent observation, when the relentless march of progress is guided not by the clash of armies or the proclamations of kings, but by the quiet, unwavering gaze of a single mind. This is the story of one such moment and one such mind. The place is Paris, at the dawn of a new century. The year is 1902. The world is alight with invention. The automobile is a noisy novelty. The first moving pictures flicker in darkened rooms, and the Eiffel Tower, a recent scar on the Parisian skyline, has become a symbol of modernity's audacious promise. But here, in this drafty, forgotten shed on the grounds of the School of Industrial Physics and Chemistry, a secret is being coaxed from the earth. A secret that will redefine our understanding of the very fabric of the universe. A secret that glows in the dark. The woman is Marie Skłodowska-Curie, and she is on a quest, not for gold or for fame, though fame will find her. She is hunting for something invisible, an element she believes in with an almost religious fervor, an element that logic and calculation tell her must exist. For 4 years, she and her husband, Pierre, have toiled in this squalid laboratory, a place a colleague once described as a cross between a stable and a potato cellar. They are attempting to distill a ghost, to isolate a single unknown substance from tons of raw industrial waste. In a small glass vial is the fruit of their Herculean labor. A substance so potent, so bizarre, it seems to defy the known laws of physics. They have named it radium, the light-bringer. In the daylight, it is unassuming, it's a simple salt, but in the dark, it holds a magic all its own. Marie would later write of these nights, how they would come back after dinner, just to see, to witness the miracle they had wrought. The sight, she wrote, was always a new delight to us. The glowing tubes looked like faint fairy lights. In the heart of Paris, the city of light, the Curies had created their own private constellations. They did not know it yet, but this beautiful, ghostly glow was the light of a new age, the atomic age. It was a light that would go on to heal millions, and a light that would one day hold the power to extinguish cities in a single blinding flash. It was a light born of relentless determination, of a partnership forged in love and science, and of a journey that began half a continent away in a nation that, officially, did not even exist. The story of this light is the story of the woman who discovered it. It begins not in the luminescence of a Paris laboratory, but in the shadows of an occupied city. Our story begins in Warsaw in the year 1867, not the capital of a proud, independent Poland, but a city under the thumb of the Russian Tsar. Street signs were in Cyrillic. The Polish language was forbidden in schools. National heroes were erased from textbooks. To be a patriot was to be a criminal, into this world of stifled identity and simmering rebellion. On the 7th of November, a child was born. She was the 5th and youngest of the Skłodowski family. They named her Maria Salomia. The world would come to know her as Marie, but to her family, she was always Mania. Her father, Władysław Skłodowski, was a man of science and letters, a teacher of mathematics and physics. He was a man who believed in the power of knowledge above all else. But in occupied Poland, knowledge was a dangerous thing. For instilling a love of Polish culture in his students, for daring to maintain a small physics laboratory for demonstrations, he was punished, demoted, his salary cut, his spirit bruised but not broken. From him, Manya and her siblings learned that an education was not a privilege, but an act of defiance. Their home became their true school. In the evenings, after the shutters were drawn, Władysław would bring out his scientific instruments. Revealing the wonders of the universe to his wide-eyed children, he read them Polish poetry in secret, keeping the flame of their heritage alive in the hearth of their home. Mania's mother, Bronisława, was the headmistress of a prestigious girls' school. She was a woman of quiet strength and deep Catholic faith, but a shadow hung over her. She was slowly, inexorably, being consumed by tuberculosis. To protect her children, she kept her distance. She never kissed or cuddled them, a small, daily heartbreak that Manya would feel her entire life. This maternal distance, born of love and necessity, instilled in the young girl a profound sense of self-reliance, and perhaps a yearning for connection that would shape her future. Tragedy struck the Skokodowski household with brutal force. When Manya was just 7, her eldest sister Zozia died of typhus, contracted from a boarder the family had taken in to make ends meet. 3 years later, her mother finally succumbed to her long illness. In the space of a few years, the warm, vibrant home was hollowed out by grief. The loss of her mother and sister shattered Manya's world. It shook her faith to its core, leaving a void where religious certainty once resided. In its place, something else began to grow. A fierce, unyielding devotion to the tangible, the provable, the empirical world of science. It was a world of laws and principles, a world that, unlike the whims of fate, made sense. Despite her grief, Manya's mind was a supernova. She graduated from her secondary school at 15, first in her class, a gold medal pinned to her dress, but her triumph was bittersweet. In Russian Poland, a gold medal was the highest honor a girl could achieve. Higher education was forbidden to women. Her path, it seemed, had come to an abrupt and infuriating end. The most brilliant student in her year faced a future as a governess or a wife. Her intellect a jewel to be locked away in a domestic box. For Manya and her sister Bronia, this was an unacceptable fate. They were children of Władysław Skokodowski, and they had inherited his rebellious spirit. They hungered for knowledge, for a life of the mind, and so they made a pact that would alter the course of both their lives. They discovered the floating university. It was not a building, but an idea. A secret underground network of classes held in private apartments across Warsaw, taught by Polish scholars for young people, especially women, barred from official education. They studied anatomy, natural history, sociology, moving from flat to flat, one step ahead of the Tsar's police. It was here, in these clandestine classrooms, that Manya's dream of a scientific life began to solidify. But it wasn't enough. The great universities of Europe beckoned, particularly the Sorbonne in Paris, a beacon of intellectual freedom. But Paris was a world away, and the Skokodowskis were nearly destitute. So the sisters devised a plan, a testament to their mutual devotion. Bronia would go to Paris first, to study medicine. Manya would stay behind, working as a governess, sending a portion of her meager salary to support her sister. Once Bronia was a doctor and earning an income, she would, in turn, pay for Manya to join her. It was a gamble that would consume Manya's youth, a sacrifice of 6 long years. Those years as a governess were some of the most difficult of her life. She was sent to live with a wealthy family on a remote sugar beet farm, a place of profound intellectual isolation. She taught children who had little interest in learning, surrounded by people who viewed her as little more than a servant. The loneliness was a physical ache. She devoured books sent by her father, teaching herself advanced mathematics and physics in the flickering lamplight of her small room. She fought off despair by organizing a secret school for the local peasant children, teaching them to read and write and polish. A crime for which she could have been exiled to Siberia. This was a small act of rebellion, a way to keep her own mind and the soul of her country alive. During this time, her heart, so long guarded, was broken. She fell in love with the family's eldest son, Kazimierz. They planned to marry, but his parents forbade it. Wanya, the brilliant penniless governess, was not a suitable match for their heir. The humiliation was a cold, hard lesson in the brutalities of class and social convention. She channeled her pain, her frustration, her loneliness into a single, burning ambition. Paris, the Sorbonne, a place where her worth would be measured not by her bank account or her social standing, but by the power of her mind. Finally, in the autumn of 1891, the summons came. Bronia had graduated. It was Manya's turn. She was 24 years old. The small amount of money saved, a 4th-class train ticket, and a wooden stool to sit on for the 3-day journey, she left Poland. As the train rattled across the German border, she watched the landscape of her homeland recede. She was leaving behind the world of Mania Skokodowska, a world of oppression, grief, and stifled dreams. She was heading towards a new life, a new identity. In Paris, she would become Marie. Paris in the 1890s was the cultural and scientific capital of the world. It was a city of art, of literature, of bohemian energy. But for the newly arrived Marie Skokodowska, it was one thing and one thing only: a place to learn, enrolled at the Faculty of Sciences at the Sorbonne. The sheer joy of it was overwhelming. To sit in lecture halls, surrounded by thousands of books, to listen to the greatest scientific minds in France. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. But the reality of her existence was brutal. She lived in a garret, a tiny, unheated attic room on the 6th floor of a Latin Quarter apartment building. She survived on bread, butter, and tea. She would study until she fainted from hunger. In the winter, the water in her wash basin froze solid. She would pile all of her clothes on top of her thin blanket. Shivering in the dark, her mind still racing with equations and chemical formulas. She was poor, she was often cold, and she was utterly, profoundly happy. She was free. Her dedication was monastic. She spoke French with a heavy Polish accent, and at first struggled to keep up with the rapid-fire lectures. So she worked harder than anyone else. She spent her days in the lecture hall and her nights in the library, poring over books until closing time, then returning to her cold garret to study more. In 1893, just 2 years after her arrival, she placed first in her master's examination in physics. The following year, driven by her insatiable need to learn, she placed second in a master's examination in mathematics. Her brilliance did not go unnoticed. A Polish acquaintance, knowing of her talent and her poverty, introduced her to a society that sponsored promising scientists. They commissioned her to conduct a study on the magnetic properties of different steels. But there was a problem. Her tiny garret had no room for the necessary equipment. She needed a laboratory. It was this simple, practical need that would lead her to the single most important encounter of her life. The acquaintance knew of someone who might have some space, a respected physicist, a specialist in magnetism. His name was Pierre Curie. Pierre Curie was 35 years old, an outsider in the formal world of French academia. He was a dreamer, a man who preferred the solitude of his laboratory to the politics of the university. He and his brother Jacques had already made a significant discovery: piezoelectricity, the principle by which pressure on certain crystals creates an electrical voltage. He was a brilliant, introspective man, with a quiet intensity and a profound love for the natural world. He had long ago despaired of ever finding a woman who could share his all-consuming devotion to science. And then, a Polish student with intense, intelligent eyes was brought to his laboratory. Their meeting was not a thunderclap of romance, but a quiet resonance of two minds, recognizing their counterpart. Marie wrote of it later, "I was struck by the expression of his clear gaze, and by the slight appearance of detachment in his whole attitude. His speech slow and deliberate, his simplicity, and his smile, at once grave and youthful, inspired confidence." They spoke of her research, of his work, of their shared vision of a life dedicated to science. Pierre was captivated. Here was the woman he had thought existed only in his imagination, a woman of passion, of intellect, of singular focus. He began a gentle, persistent courtship. He visited her in her garret, a place few others ever saw. He gave her a copy of his latest paper, on symmetry and physics, inscribed with the words, "To Mademoiselle Skakowska," with the respect and friendship of the author. But Marie was hesitant. Her plan had always been to return to Poland to use her hard-won education to serve her homeland. A life in Paris, even a life with Pierre, felt like a betrayal of that patriotic duty. Pierre's plea was simple and profound. He wrote to her during her summer vacation in Poland, "It would be a beautiful thing, a thing I dare not hope, if we could spend our life near each other, hypnotized by our dreams, your patriotic dream, our humanitarian dream, and our scientific dream." He was even willing to move to Poland for her. His sincerity, his willingness to share not just his life but his entire world with her, finally broke down her resistance. She realized her scientific dream could not be fulfilled in Poland, and that a life without Pierre would be a life of profound loneliness. In the summer of 1895, they were married in a simple civil ceremony. Marie wore a dark blue dress, which would serve as her laboratory uniform for years to come. Their honeymoon was a bicycle tour of the French countryside. Their union was not just a marriage. It was the formation of the most formidable scientific partnership the world had ever seen. The first years of their marriage were a whirlwind of activity. Marie continued her research on magnetism. In 1897, their first daughter was born. Marie, determined not to be a distant mother like her own, juggled the demands of motherhood with the rigors of her scientific work. She was now ready to pursue her doctorate, a rare feat for a woman at the time. All she needed was a topic. At that very moment, the world of physics was buzzing with a strange and unexplained discovery. In 1896, the physicist Henry Becquerel had accidentally discovered that uranium salts, left in a drawer with a photographic plate, emitted a mysterious energy. They seemed to radiate rays that could pass through solid matter, much like the newly discovered X-rays. But unlike X-rays, which were produced by a machine, these uranium rays appeared to be an intrinsic property of the element itself, pouring out endlessly with no external energy source. It was a phenomenon that seemed to contradict the fundamental laws of physics. The atom was supposed to be a solid, indivisible particle, the basic, unchanging building block of matter. How could it be spontaneously emitting energy? Most physicists, fascinated by the more dramatic X-rays, paid Becquerel's discovery little mind. It was a curiosity, a loose thread in the fabric of science. But for Marie Curie, this loose thread was an irresistible puzzle. Here was a subject for her doctorate, a field that was new, unexplored, and promised to reveal something fundamental about the nature of matter. Using a sensitive electrometer designed by Pierre and his brother, Marie began a systematic investigation. She set out to measure the faint electrical charge produced by the mysterious uranium rays. She tested every known element, looking for similar properties. She found that only one other element, thorium, emitted these rays. But her methodical work soon led her to a startling discovery. She began testing minerals, complex ores containing various elements. She found that a sample of pitchblende, a mineral rich in uranium, was far more active, 4 times more active than the amount of pure uranium it contained could account for. She checked her measurements. She rechecked them. The results were the same. The pitchblende was radiating with an impossible intensity. For Marie, the conclusion was inescapable, however radical it seemed. There had to be something else in the pitchblende, a new element tiny in quantity, but enormous in power, hiding within the OR, an element whose existence no one had ever suspected. When she showed her findings to Pierre, he immediately grasped the significance of her work. He abandoned his own research on crystals to join her in this new, exhilarating quest. Their hunt for the unknown element had begun. The first step was to prove its existence chemically. Working in their small, cluttered storeroom, they began the painstaking process of chemical analysis, separating the pitchblende into its constituent components. They found that 2 separate chemical fractions showed intense activity. The first, they reasoned, must contain one new element. In a paper published in July 1898, they announced its discovery. Marie named it polonium, in honor of her beloved captive homeland. But the second fraction was even more powerful, its activity astonishing. This, they knew, was the big one. The element responsible for the most intense radiation. In December of 1898, they announced its existence, called it radium, from the Latin word for ray. They had discovered not one, but 2 new elements. But the scientific establishment was skeptical. To prove their discovery beyond all doubt, they had to do something monumental. They had to isolate radium. They had to see it, weigh it, and determine its atomic weight. They needed to produce a pure sample. To do that, they would need a mountain of pitchblende and a place to process it. The only space the university would give them was the abandoned shed across the courtyard. It had a leaky glass roof and a dirt floor. It was freezing in the winter and suffocatingly hot in the summer. It was here, in this dilapidated shack, that Marie Curie would undertake the most physically demanding and scientifically significant work of her life. The raw material came from a mine in Bohemia, tons of it, a brownish, gritty industrial waste product, delivered to their shed in heavy sacks. The work was brutal, more like factory labor than science. Pierre, the physicist, focused on measuring the properties of the radiation. Marie, the chemist, took on the colossal task of purification. For hours on end, she stood over a bubbling cauldron in the courtyard, stirring the boiling pitchblende with an iron rod as tall as she was. The fumes were noxious, stinging her eyes and choking her lungs. She would carry heavy basins of liquid, pouring and filtering, crystallizing and recrystallizing, gradually, painstakingly, refining the ore. Each step concentrated the radium, making the solution more and more radioactive. For 4 years, this was their life. Cycle of back-breaking labor and meticulous measurement. Their clothes were stained with chemicals and dust. Their hands were cracked and burned. They were perpetually exhausted, but they were driven by a shared, obsessive passion. Marie would later describe these years as the happiest and most heroic of her life. They were entirely consumed by their shared quest, working in perfect intellectual and emotional harmony. In the evenings, they would talk of their work, of the strange properties of the rays that seemed to pour from their and at night they would return to the dark shed just to see the faint magical glow of their progress. Those glowing tubes were a promise, a confirmation that they were on the right path, that deep within the dross of the earth, a powerful new secret was waiting to be born. By 1902, after processing several tons of pitch blende, Marie finally succeeded. From a mountain of ore, she had produced a tiny pinch of pure radium chloride, about 1/10 of a gram. It was a whitish powder, but it shone in the dark with its ghostly blue light. She had done it. She had isolated radium. She'd measured its atomic weight. Placing it firmly on the periodic table of elements, the ghost had been made manifest. The discovery was complete. The implications were staggering. Here was an element that continuously emitted heat and light, seemingly from nothing. It defied the most basic principle of science, the conservation of energy. It suggested that the atom was not a solid, static particle, but a tiny, dynamic universe, containing vast, untapped stores of energy. Marie Curie, in her quest to understand a strange glow, had kicked open the door to the atomic age. In 1903, the Nobel Committee announced its prize in physics. It was to be awarded to Henri Becquerel and Pierre Curie for their work on radiation. Marie's name was not included. In the eyes of the committee, it was inconceivable that a woman could be the primary intellectual force behind such a momentous discovery. Pierre was outraged. He wrote to the committee, stating that he would not accept the prize unless Marie was included. The work, he insisted, was hers. Faced with his ultimatum and the undeniable evidence of her published papers, the committee relented. In December 1903, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Henri Becquerel, Pierre Curie, and Marie Curie, the first woman in history to receive it. Fame descended upon the Curies like an avalanche. They were no longer anonymous researchers or global celebrities. Journalists hounded them. Their squalid shed became a tourist attraction. The quiet, contemplative life they cherished was shattered. Pierre, who hated the spotlight, found it unbearable. Marie, though more resilient, found the endless distractions a thief of her precious time. They were deluged with letters, with requests, with honors, and with questions. The world wanted to know, what was this radium? What could it do? They soon discovered one of its most profound abilities. It was found that the radiation from radium could destroy diseased cells, particularly cancerous ones. It could shrink tumors. A new field of medicine, which would come to be known as cryotherapy, was born. Radium was hailed as a miracle cure, but the Curies made a momentous decision. They could have patented the process for isolating radium, making them unimaginably wealthy. They refused. Radium, they declared, was an element. It belonged to the people. Its benefits should be available to all of humanity. It was an act of extraordinary idealism, one that would cement their legend, but would also mean they would struggle for funding for the rest of their lives. But as the world celebrated the healing power of their discovery, a darker side began to emerge. The Curies themselves were suffering from its effects. They were constantly tired. Their fingertips were burned, scarred, and inflamed from handling radium tubes. Pierre's health was in a steep decline. He was plagued by severe debilitating pain in his legs. They were suffering from what we now call radiation sickness. They were the first human beings to experience the slow, cellular destruction caused by prolonged exposure to radioactivity. The very thing that had made them famous was slowly, silently, poisoning them. Their shared work, their intense love, and their family had created a small, complete world. But on April 19, 1906, that world was irrevocably destroyed. It was a rainy Thursday in Paris. Pierre, distracted and exhausted, was crossing a busy street. He slipped on the wet pavement and fell directly into the path of a heavy, horse-drawn carriage. The rear wheel crushed his skull, killing him instantly.
Ow.
The news was brought to Marie. She retreated into a shell of silent, profound grief. At the funeral, she stood like a statue, her face a mask of stone. The light had gone out of her life. She began a new diary, not a record of her days, but a series of letters to her dead husband. "Pier, my Pier, there you are, calm as a poor wounded man sleeping, wrapped in your sheets. Your lips that I used to kiss are pale." The world expected her to fade away, a grieving widow, her scientific life over. The University of Paris offered her a widow's pension. She refused it, in a move that was both radical and utterly necessary for her survival. She asked for something else. She asked for his job.
Out.
The University Council appointed Marie Curie to the professorship that had been created for her husband. She would be the first female professor in the 650-year history of the Sorbonne. On November 5, 1906, she walked into the lecture hall to give her first class. It was packed, not just with students, but with journalists, socialites, and dignitaries, all curious to see the famous widow. They expected tears, a sentimental tribute to her lost husband. Marie Curie gave them science. She walked to the podium, paused for a moment in the silent, expectant room, and began. Her first sentence was the exact sentence where Pierre had left off in his last lecture. There was no preamble, no acknowledgement of the drama. There was only the work. The work had to continue. In the solitude of her grief, she threw herself into her research with a ferocious intensity. She was determined to honor Pierre's memory in the only way she knew how, by cementing the legacy of their shared discovery. She set herself an immense task: to isolate radium not as a salt, but as a pure metallic element. It was a monumental challenge, but in 1910, she succeeded. She also single-handedly defined the international standard of measurement for radiation, which was, in her honor, named the Curie. But just as she was reaching new heights of scientific achievement, a new storm was gathering. A storm of xenophobia, sexism, and scandal that would threaten to destroy her career and her reputation. Marie had grown close to a fellow physicist, a brilliant married man named Paul Langevin. He was a former student of Pierre's, and their shared grief and intellectual passion blossomed into love. When their private letters were stolen and leaked to the press, the reaction was vicious. The right-wing newspapers, which had long resented this foreign intellectual woman, launched a brutal character assassination. She was branded a homewrecker, a foreign Jewish adventuress, though she was neither Jewish nor an adventuress. Mobs gathered outside her home, throwing stones and screaming insults, terrorizing her and her daughters. It was a terrifying ordeal that exposed the dark underbelly of the society that had once celebrated her. The scandal broke just as the Swedish Academy was about to make an announcement. They had decided to award Marie Curie a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for her isolation of pure radium. It was an unprecedented honor. She would be the first person ever to win 2 Nobels. But in the wake of the scandal, members of the Academy wrote to her, suggesting she decline the prize until her name was cleared. Her response was a thunderclap of defiance. "The prize has been awarded for the discovery of radium and polonium," she wrote. "I believe that there is no connection between my scientific work and the facts of private life. I cannot accept that the appreciation of the value of scientific work should be influenced by libel and slander concerning private life." In the dead of winter, at the height of the scandal, she traveled to Stockholm to accept her prize. She stood before the King of Sweden and the world's scientific elite. A solitary woman who had been publicly vilified and delivered her Nobel lecture. She spoke of radium, of radioactivity, and she took care at every turn. To credit the foundational work of Pierre Curie, it was a moment of supreme dignity and unwavering strength. The ordeal, however, took a severe toll on her health. She collapsed from a kidney ailment, exacerbated by stress and years of radiation exposure. She spent months recovering in seclusion, under an assumed name, but even this could not break her. Her gaze was now fixed on a new, ambitious dream: the creation of a world-class research institute in Paris. A laboratory worthy of the science of radioactivity. The Radium Institute. The construction of the institute was barely complete when, in the summer of 1914, the world plunged into war. The Great War. The German army was marching towards Paris. Marie's first thought was to protect her life's work. She took her entire stock of radium, a single gram worth of fortune, packed it in a heavy lead-lined case, and transported it by train to Bordeaux, where she deposited it in a bank vault. Her scientific treasure was safe, but her work was not over. It was about to enter its most practical, and perhaps its most heroic, phase. She knew that X-rays were crucial for locating bullets and shrapnel in wounded soldiers, saving limbs and lives. But most hospitals were far from the front lines, and the few X-ray machines they had were stationary. Soldiers were dying for lack of basic medical imaging. Marie had an idea. She would create a mobile radiography unit. She procured a car, persuaded automobile body shops to convert it into a van, and with help from charitable donors, equipped it with a dynamo and X-ray apparatus. She taught herself how to drive, how to change a tire, and how to operate the primitive, often dangerous X-ray equipment. These mobile units became known as petites curies, little curies. With her 17-year-old daughter, now her trusted assistant, Marie drove her petite curie to the battlefields of the Western Front, in the chaos and carnage of casualty clearing stations. Just behind the lines of battle, she worked tirelessly, training military doctors and orderlies to use the technology. She was unflinching, often working under the threat of artillery fire. She and her team of 150 women, whom she had trained, would go on to install 200 radiological rooms in field hospitals and operate 20 mobile units. It is estimated that Marie Curie's X-ray service treated over 1 million wounded soldiers. The quiet researcher from the Parisian shed had become a battlefield savior. Her abstract science transformed into an instrument of immediate, tangible mercy. After the war, she returned to her new Radium Institute, which quickly became a global center for the study of radioactivity. She gathered around her a new generation of scientists, including her daughter, who would follow in her parents' footsteps and go on to win a Nobel Prize of her own. Marie Curie was now more than just a scientist. She was a stateswoman of science, a global icon. But her institute was perpetually short on funds, and radium itself was now astronomically expensive. The gram she had once isolated was now worth over $100,000, far beyond her means. The world's supply of radium was largely controlled by the United States, and it was from America that an unlikely rescuer appeared. An American journalist named Missy Maloney was a great admirer of Madame Curie. When she interviewed Marie in 1920 and learned that the world's most famous scientist did not even have enough radium to conduct her own experiments, she was appalled. Maloney launched a national campaign, the Marie Curie Radium Fund. She rallied the women of America, raising $100,000 dollar by dollar to purchase a single gram of radium and present it to Marie. In 1921, Marie Curie, accompanied by her daughters, sailed for the United States. Her visit was a national event. She was shy, frail, and uncomfortable with the relentless publicity, but she endured it with grace. She was awarded honorary degrees from dozens of universities. She was met by cheering crowds. The highlight of her trip was a ceremony at the White House, where President Warren G. Harding presented her with a symbolic key to the lead-lined box containing her gram of radium. The woman who had given radium to the world was now receiving it back as a gift. She returned to her work, her body growing ever weaker, her health steadily failing. The years of exposure to radiation were finally exacting their ultimate price. She was suffering from aplastic anemia, a condition where the bone marrow ceases to produce new blood cells. It was a direct consequence of her life's work. The element she had brought into the world was now bringing about her end. Even in her final days, her mind remained that of a scientist. She documented her own symptoms, her fading vision, the humming in her ears with a detached clinical curiosity. On July 4, 1934, at a sanatorium in the French Alps, Marie Skłodowska-Curie died. She was 66 years old. The doctor who treated her wrote that the bone marrow could not react, probably because it had been injured by a long accumulation of radiations. She was buried next to Pierre, in a small cemetery in Sceaux, just outside Paris. Her body, like his, was so radioactive that it had to be interred in a lead-lined coffin. Her laboratory notebooks, still containing the faint, dusty traces of the elements she handled, are stored today in lined boxes at France's National Library. Anyone wishing to consult them must sign a waiver and wear protective clothing. They are still radiating her legacy. In 1995, in a final extraordinary tribute, the remains of Marie and Pierre Curie were moved to the in Paris, the final resting place of France's greatest national heroes. She was the first woman to be honored there on her own merits. Polish girl who defied an empire. A young woman who starved in a garret for the sake of knowledge. A scientist who changed our understanding of the universe. A patriot, a mother, a healer, and a martyr to the very science she pioneered. The light that Marie Curie coaxed from the earth in that miserable shed has had a dual and terrible legacy. It has led to nuclear power, which lights our cities, and to nuclear weapons, which threaten to extinguish them. It has cured diseases, and it has caused them. It is a perfect and terrifying symbol of humanity's genius for creation and its capacity for destruction. But the light of Marie Curie's life is a story of a different kind. It is the story of an unbreakable will, of a mind that refused to be silenced, of a heart that endured unimaginable loss and persevered. She opened up the hidden universe of the atom, and in doing so, unleashed forces that would shape the destiny of the 20th century and beyond. She proved that the source of true power lies not in armies or in empires, but in the relentless, courageous, and uncompromising pursuit of knowledge. Her life was a testament to a simple, radical idea that there is no force in the world more powerful than a human mind set free. And in that collective memory, it is not the steel or the rivets that hold the most power, but the human hearts that beat within the great ship's hull. The story of the Titanic is not ultimately about a ship, but about the people. Its passenger list was a cross-section of a world on the brink of change, a manifest of dreams, ambitions, and secrets, all bound for a single, awful destiny. To truly understand the tragedy, we must leave the grand narrative of the vessel and descend to the intimate scale of the individual soul. We must walk the decks in their shoes, feel the chill of the air on their skin, and see the iceberg through their eyes. In cabin C-89, the wealthiest man on board, John Jacob Astor IV, was returning to America with his new 18-year-old bride, Madeline. Astor, at 47, was a titan of the Gilded Age, a scion of immense inherited wealth who had diversified into real estate, finance, and invention. He was a figure of national prominence, but also of national scandal. His recent messy divorce and his swift marriage to a woman younger than his own son had been tabloid fodder for months. They had embarked on a long tour of Europe and Egypt as an extended honeymoon, waiting for the gossip to die down. The Titanic was their passage home, a return to a life of unimaginable privilege, and for Madeline, the birth of their first child. She was 5 months pregnant. When the ship shuddered, Astor was unconcerned. He went to investigate, returning to his wife to reassure her that a minor incident had occurred. He even joked, picking up a piece of ice that had fallen on the deck. "I asked for ice in my drink, but this is ridiculous." As the seriousness of the situation became clear, his calm demeanor held. He escorted Madeline, her maid, and her nurse through the increasingly chaotic boat deck. He saw them safely into lifeboat, for one of the last to leave the starboard side. He then asked Second Officer Leitler if, given his wife's delicate condition, he might be permitted to join her. Leitler, adhering strictly to his women and children only rule on the port side, refused him flatly. Astor, a man for whom the word no was a foreign concept, simply accepted the verdict. He stepped back, straightened his posture, and asked for the lifeboat's number, so he could find his wife later. He was last seen standing on the deck, smoking a cigarette with the writer Jacques Futrelle, two gentlemen of immense accomplishment, watching the lights of the lifeboat, carrying his wife and his unborn child recede into the vast, unforgiving darkness. His body would later be recovered by the cable ship Macabinet, his immense fortune unable to purchase him a single extra moment of life. Madeline would survive, give birth to a son she would name John Jacob Astor Vi, and live as a widow for the rest of her days, a living relic of a love story, cut short by ice and protocol. Not far from where Astor stood, another story of profound love reached its final, heartbreaking chapter. Isidore Straus, the owner of Macy's department store, and his wife Ida, were a fixture of New York society. But not for their wealth alone. They were renowned for their unusually close and devoted 60-year marriage. Friends noted they were rarely seen apart, and their letters were filled with affection. They were returning from a winter in Europe. As the evacuation unfolded, Ida was offered a seat in Lifeboat 8. She prepared to board, but then turned back. Luck, however, had nothing to do with the fate of Joseph Bruce Ismay. The chairman of the White Star Line was the most senior official on the ship, and in the eyes of the public, the man most responsible for its fate. His presence on the voyage was, as a promoter, an observer, a king surveying his new domain. Survivors reported seeing him on the bridge. She looked at her husband, his hair white with age, standing dutifully on the deck, and she refused to go. Those around her urged her to save herself. A ship's officer told Isidore that, given his age, no one would object to him entering the boat with his wife, but Isidore Strauss refused. He would not go before the other men. Ida then stepped away from the lifeboat, taking her husband's arm. "We have lived together for many years," she said, her voice clear and steady amidst the rising noise. "Where you go, I go." She gave her fur coat to her maid, Ellen Bird, insisting she take it as she would no longer have need of it, and saw her safely into the boat. The last time anyone saw Isidore and Ida Strauss, they were sitting side by side in a pair of deck chairs on the tilting boat deck. A silent, unshakable testament to a love that was stronger than the fear of death itself. They faced the end together, as they had faced everything in life, this stoic acceptance of fate. This adherence to an Edwardian code of honor was a recurring theme among the ship's elite. Benjamin Guggenheim, the American mining tycoon, had been asleep when the iceberg struck. He was woken by his mistress, the French singer Aubart, and his valet Victor Giglio. He quickly realized the gravity of the situation. He assisted Miss Aubart and her maid into Lifeboat 9. He knew there was no hope for him. He and his valet then returned to their cabins and changed out of their lifebelts and sweaters and into their finest evening wear, complete with top hats. They reappeared on the deck, looking as if they were prepared for a night at the opera. A survivor recalled Guggenheim approaching her and asking her to deliver a message. "Tell my wife," he said, "if it should happen that my secretary and I both go down, tell her I played the game out straight to the end. No woman shall be left aboard this ship because I was a coward." He was last seen in the grand foyer, near the foot of the great staircase, calmly sipping a brandy and smoking a cigar. "We've dressed up in our best," he reportedly announced, "and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." It was a final, theatrical gesture, a performance of courage and class in the face of oblivion. But not all of the Titanic's heroines faced their fate with quiet resignation. In Lifeboat 6, a force of nature by the name of Margaret Brown was proving that survival was not a matter of class, but of will. Brown, who would go down in history as the unsinkable Molly Brown, was the daughter of poor Irish immigrants. She had married a man who struck it rich in the Colorado gold mines, and she was a vibrant, outspoken example of new money. Looked down upon by the old money aristocrats of Denver and New York, on the Titanic, she was a whirlwind of energy. When the chaos began, she helped others into the lifeboats, before she was finally forced into number 6 herself. The boat was under the command of Quartermaster Robert Hickens. The man who had been at the helm when the ship struck the iceberg, Hickens was, by all accounts, demoralized and terrified. He refused to allow the women to row, fearing they would exhaust themselves. And he refused to go back to the site of the sinking to look for survivors, arguing they would be swamped. Margaret Brown would have none of it. She argued fiercely with Hickens, her voice ringing out across the water. She organized the other women, encouraged them to row to keep warm, and took an oar herself. She wrapped her own ermine stole around a freezing survivor. Her sheer force of personality rallied the spirits of the despondent women in the boat. While the legend of her threatening to throw Hickens overboard is likely an exaggeration, her leadership was undeniable. She became the de facto captain of Lifeboat 6, a plain-speaking, iron-willed woman from Colorado who proved herself more of a leader than many of the trained men around her. Upon her arrival on the Carpathia, she did not rest. She immediately began organizing a committee of wealthy survivors to raise funds for the destitute, third-class passengers who had lost everything. When she was presented with an award by the committee for her heroism, she characteristically remarked, "I was just lucky," urging Captain Smith to increase speed for a triumphant early arrival in New York. When the disaster struck, Ismay assisted in loading some of the boats. But then, in a moment that would define the rest of his life, he stepped into collapsible sea. One of the very last lifeboats to leave the ship as it was being lowered. He would later testify that he did so only because there were no other women or children in the vicinity, and the boat was about to be lowered with empty seats. He claimed he turned his back on the sinking ship, unable to watch the final moments of his greatest creation. He survived, but his reputation did not. In the court of public opinion, he was tried and convicted of cowardice. William Randolph Hearst's newspapers ran scathing editorials, depicting him as Brute Ismay. He was portrayed as a man who had pushed the ship to its doom, and then saved himself while women and children perished. The inquiries would officially exonerate him, but society never did. He became a recluse, his name forever synonymous with corporate arrogance and personal disgrace. The man who had dreamed of the Titanic would be haunted by its ghost until the day he died. The stories of the second class are less often told, but no less poignant. Here, the dreams were not of maintaining dynasties, but of building comfortable lives. Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher from London, was traveling to America for a holiday. A keen observer, his experience provides one of the clearest and most rational accounts of the disaster. He felt the collision as a slight jarring sensation. He went on deck, saw the iceberg drift away, and noted the strange, unsettling silence as the engine stopped. He watched the calm, almost lackadaisical loading of the first lifeboats. It was Beasley who noticed the ship's band playing ragtime, a sound of determined cheerfulness that seemed utterly at odds with the growing list of the deck beneath his feet. He was ordered into Lifeboat 13, as his boat was being lowered. It was nearly crushed by the discharge of water from the ship's condensers. Then, as it reached the water, it drifted directly underneath the descending Lifeboat 15. Only the quick action of a stoker, who cut the ropes with a pocket knife, allowed them to pull away just seconds before they would have been smashed. From the relative safety of the lifeboat, Beasley watched the great ship's final moments, a silent, scientific observer to a tragedy of epic proportions. Would go on to write a best-selling book, The Loss of the SS Titanic, a clear-eyed and invaluable historical document. But for every survivor who could write their story, there were families erased from history. The Navratil family's story is a heartbreaking tale of love and deception. Michel Navratil, a tailor from Nice, France, was embroiled in a bitter custody dispute with his estranged wife. In a desperate act, he abducted his two young sons, 4-year-old Michel Jr. and 2-year-old Edmund. Using the assumed name Louis M. Hoffman, he bought second-class tickets on the Titanic, hoping to start a new life with his boys in America. For a few days, the boys had the run of the ship, a grand adventure with their loving father. When the ship began to sink, Navratil acted quickly. He dressed the boys in warm clothes and carried them to the boat deck. He managed to get them into the last lifeboat to be successfully launched, Collapsible D, just before placing his sons in the boat. He passed them to another passenger, saying, "My child, when your mother comes for you, as she surely will, tell her that I loved her dearly and still do. Tell her I expected her to follow us, so that we might all live happily together in the peace and freedom of the new world." Michel Navratil then stepped back and was lost to the sea. The two little boys, speaking only French, arrived on the Carpathia as nameless orphans. Dubbed Louis and Lola by the press, their cherubic faces were published in newspapers around the world. Their mother, Marcelle Navratil, back in France, had been searching frantically for her missing sons. She saw their pictures in a newspaper and, with the help of the White Star Line, sailed to New York to be reunited with them. Michel Jr., the last male survivor of the disaster, would live to be 92. Forever haunted by the memory of his father's final sacrifice, the greatest loss of life by far was in the ship's third class. Here, the Titanic was not a floating hotel. It was a vessel of hope, carried over 700 immigrants, people who had sold everything they owned for a chance at a new beginning. Their stories are largely unrecorded, their voices lost to the depths. The story of the Sage family stands as a grim monument to their collective fate. John and Annie Sage, along with their 9 children, ranging in age from 4 to 20, were moving from Peterborough, England, to Jacksonville, Florida, where they planned to buy a pecan farm. They were a large, boisterous, hopeful family, representing the very dream the Titanic was meant to carry. Not a single one of them survived. Their story is a stark reminder that the women and children first policy, however noble in principle, was a practical failure for those trapped in the lower decks. By the time Minnie and Steerage were able to navigate the confusing maze of corridors and locked gates to reach the boat deck, most of the lifeboats were already gone. Their hopes for a new life on a pecan farm in Florida now lie in the eternal darkness. 2.5 miles below the surface of the Atlantic. And what of the crew, the men who ran the great ship? Their stories are of duty and sacrifice in the face of impossible odds. Captain Edward J. Smith, the beloved Commodore of the White Star Line, on his final voyage before retirement, faced an unimaginable crisis. The historical record of his final hours is fragmented, a mosaic of conflicting survivor accounts. Some say he was paralyzed by indecision, a broken man overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster he had presided over. Others paint a picture of quiet heroism. He was seen on the bridge, in the wireless room, and on the boat deck, calmly giving orders and helping passengers. As the end neared, he released the crew from their duties with the famous words, "Be British, boys, be British," effectively telling them to save themselves if they could. The most enduring image is of him standing alone on the bridge, as it slid beneath the waves. The captain going down with his ship, the ultimate fulfillment of maritime tradition. His senior officers performed their duties with a mixture of rigid discipline and desperate improvisation. First Officer William Murdoch, on watch when the iceberg was sighted, made the split-second decisions that, while ultimately futile, attempted to save the ship. He then took charge of the evacuation on the starboard side, working frantically to launch the boats. His interpretation of the women and children first rule was more lenient than Leitler's, allowing men to board if there were empty seats. He was last seen trying to free the collapsible lifeboats. As the water washed over the deck, his fate is uncertain. Some say he shot himself in the final moments, a rumor that has never been substantiated. He did not survive. Second Officer Charles Leitler, in charge of the port side evacuation, was a man of stern, unbending principle. His rigid adherence to women and children only meant that some lifeboats left his side of the ship with empty seats that could have been filled by men. But his actions were born of a deep sense of duty, not malice. In the final moments, he was sucked down with the ship, pinned against the ventilation shaft by the pressure of the water. A blast of hot air from the depths of the ship erupted from the shaft, blowing him back to the surface, gasping for air. He found his way to the overturned collapsible B, where he took command of the 30 or so men clinging precariously to its hull. For hours, he balanced the men, teaching them to shift their weight with the swell of the sea to keep the unstable raft from capsizing. Leitler's incredible survival and his calm, detailed testimony at the inquiries would make him the highest-ranking officer to survive and the primary source for the official history of the sinking. The Silent Room, the two Marconi wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, became the heroes who connected the dying ship to the outside world. They were the reason the Carpathia was on its way. They had been working for hours, clearing a backlog of private passenger messages. When the order came from Captain Smith to send the distress call, they did not hesitate. Phillips, the senior operator, tapped out the CQD and SOS signals with cool precision. Even as the captain periodically returned to tell them the situation was worsening, water began to flood their small cabin. As the power from the ship's main generators faded, they switched to the emergency battery supply, their signal growing weaker and weaker. Bride later recalled seeing a stoker attempt to steal Phillips's life jacket. Phillips, exhausted and focused, fought him off. Captain Smith entered a final time and released them from their duty. Bride managed to escape, finding his way to the overturned collapsible B. Jack Phillips, however, remained at his post until the very end, his fingers on the telegraph key. He made it to a lifeboat, but died of exposure before the Carpathia arrived. His final, desperate signals were the vital link that saved 706 lives. And deep within the ship, in the fiery, thundering heart of the Titanic, a group of men performed the ultimate act of unseen heroism. The 25 engineers and their team of stokers and firemen, the Black Gang, understood the mechanics of the ship better than anyone. They knew long before the passengers on the deck that the damage was fatal, yet not one of them abandoned his post. They stayed below in the rising freezing water, surrounded by the terrifying noise of escaping steam, to keep the steam pumps running, to slow the flooding, and most importantly, to keep the ship's electrical generators working. The lights of the Titanic, which burned almost to the very end, were their doing. The power for the wireless, which sent the call for help, came from them. Their actions allowed the evacuation on the upper decks to proceed in light, rather than in terrifying darkness. They bought precious, vital minutes for the passengers and crew. Their sacrifice, made far from the eyes of any survivor who could tell their tale, was absolute. Every single one of them was lost. They were the silent, anonymous heroes whose devotion to duty made the survival of anyone at all a possibility. While these acts of heroism and sacrifice unfolded on the Titanic, another ship lay nearby, a silent witness to the tragedy. Her name was the SS Californian, a freighter commanded by Captain Stanley Lord. At around 10:30 p.m., on the night of the 14th, Captain Lord had stopped his ship for the night. Finding himself surrounded by a dense field of ice, he instructed his wireless operator, Cyril Evans, to warn other ships in the area. It was Evans who sent the message that was so curtly dismissed by the Titanic's overworked operator, Jack Phillips. After being told to shut up, Evans simply turned off his equipment and went to bed, as was common practice. The Californian was now deaf to the Titanic's distress calls, but she was not blind. Sometime after midnight, officers on the Californian's bridge saw the lights of a large steamer approaching from the southeast. They watched as the ship stopped. Then, they saw a series of white rockets being fired into the air, 8 of them in total over the course of an hour and a half. They puzzled over their meaning. Rockets were the recognized official signal for distress. Yet the ship on the horizon seemed large and powerful, and showed no other signs of trouble. It was not using its signal lamp. Captain Lord was awakened and informed of the rockets. He asked if they were company signals. His officers thought not. But Lord, from the warmth of his chart room, concluded they were not distress signals and went back to sleep. His crew watched, confused and uneasy. As the strange ship began to disappear, its lights vanishing from view as if it were sinking, they watched until it was gone. The next morning, the Californian's wireless operator switched his set back on and learned the catastrophic news. The ship they had watched fire rockets and then disappear was almost certainly the Titanic. They were only about 19 miles away. They could have reached her in under an hour. They could have saved hundreds, perhaps everyone who was in the water. The inaction of the Californian became one of the most bitter and enduring controversies of the Titanic disaster. Captain Stanley Lord would be condemned by both the American and British inquiries. He was found to have been negligent in his duty to render aid. He would spend the rest of his life fighting to clear his name, arguing that the ship he saw was not the Titanic, but another, unidentified vessel. The mystery ship, seen by some Titanic survivors between them and the Californian, added to the confusion. But the weight of the evidence against him was overwhelming. The story of the Californian is the great what-if of the Titanic tragedy, a haunting tale of missed signals and failed duty. A ghost ship that watched from the sidelines as 1,500 people froze to death in the icy water. The reckoning for all these actions, for the failures of technology and the frailties of human judgment, began almost as soon as the survivors reached land. The world demanded answers. It demanded accountability. In New York, the American inquiry, chaired by the pugnacious Senator William Alden Smith, convened with astonishing speed at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Smith was a populist from Michigan, deeply suspicious of the powerful British Shipping Trust. His investigation was aggressive, theatrical, and at times, poorly informed about maritime practices, but it was driven by a genuine desire to uncover the truth for the public. He put a terrified Bruce Ismay on the stand for days, grilling him relentlessly about the ship's speed, the number of lifeboats, and his own escape. He questioned the surviving officers Lightler, Lowe, and others, forcing the details of the sinking into the public record for the first time. The American inquiry was raw, emotional, and it painted a damning picture of corporate complacency and regulatory failure. In London, the British inquiry, presided over by Lord Mersey, was a far more stately and technical affair. Held in the Scottish Drill Hall, it was an investigation by the maritime establishment of itself. Lord Mersey was a distinguished jurist, and his panel of experts included men with deep ties to the shipping industry. The tone was less accusatory, the questions more focused on naval architecture, iceberg physics, and the minutiae of Board of Trade regulations. Second Officer Littler was a star witness, his calm professionalism and technical expertise shaping much of the inquiry's conclusions. The British inquiry ultimately placed the blame on the high speed of the ship in dangerous waters, a standard practice at the time which it deemed negligent only in hindsight. It exonerated the White Star Line of any overt wrongdoing and largely cleared Bruce Ismay. It saved its harshest condemnation for the captain of the SS Californian. The findings were too many, a whitewash, an attempt by the establishment to protect its own. But taken together, the two inquiries, for all their flaws, created a detailed and indelible record of the disaster. They exposed the shocking inadequacy of lifeboat regulations, which had not kept pace with the growing size of ships. They highlighted the fatal overconfidence that had permeated every level of the enterprise. From the designers to the captain, they revealed the critical role that wireless telegraphy could play in maritime safety, the catastrophic consequences of its misuse. The result was a sea change in international law. The Safety of Life at Sea Convention of 1914 was a direct consequence of the Titanic. It mandated 24-hour radio watches, established the International Ice Patrol, and most famously, it required that every vessel carry enough lifeboat space for every single person on board. The 1,500 people who died in the North Atlantic did not die in vain. Their loss became the catalyst for a new era of maritime safety, a legacy written in law and practiced on the high seas to this very day, ensuring that a tragedy on the scale of the Titanic would never happen again. The great ship had sunk, but from its watery grave, it had taught the world a lesson it would never forget. The lessons written in the wake of the Titanic were stark, practical, and inked in the cold calculus of maritime law. But the true story of the aftermath was not written in legislative chambers or committee rooms, was etched onto the human heart. For the 706 survivors brought to New York aboard the Carpathia, the journey was not over. In many ways it had just begun. They'd survived the icy water, but now they had to navigate a lifetime of grief and trauma, forever defined by the night they lived while so many others died. They were the living ghosts of the great liner, and the world was desperate to hear their stories. The moment they stepped onto the pier in New York, they were engulfed by a maelstrom of press and public curiosity. They were celebrities of a new and morbid kind. Reporters offered them money for exclusive interviews. Vaudeville houses offered them contracts to simply appear on stage and recount their ordeal. The hunger for details was insatiable. One of the first to capitalize on this was the silent film actress Dorothy Gibson, first-class survivor who had been in the first lifeboat launched, Lifeboat 7. She arrived in New York and, within a week, was reenacting her experience for a film camera. The movie, titled Saved from the Titanic, was a sensational hit. Gibson even wore the same white silk evening dress she had been wearing on the night of the sinking. The film was released less than a month after the disaster, a testament to the public's ravenous appetite. But the experience took a profound psychological toll. Shortly after the film's release, Gibson suffered a mental breakdown and abandoned her film career, a woman haunted by the ghosts she had helped to create. For many survivors, the aftermath was a life sentence of what we would now call post-traumatic stress. Eva Hart, a 7-year-old second-class passenger who lost her father, was haunted for the rest of her life by the memory of the ship S-band playing and the terrible collective scream of the drowning. She spoke of being plagued by nightmares for decades. The phrase Titanic widow became a tragic descriptor for hundreds of women who had to rebuild their lives from scratch. Many of them steerage passengers who had arrived in America with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a profound public grief. Charities and relief funds, like the one organized by the indefatigable Margaret Brown, sprang up to help them, but no amount of money could replace what they had lost. The disaster immediately embedded itself in the bedrock of popular culture, becoming an instant modern myth. Balladeers and folk singers composed mournful songs, the most famous of which, "The Wreck of the Titanic," became a staple of American folk music, its verses telling a simple, moralistic tale of divine retribution against human pride. The story was so powerful because it could mean so many things to so many people. It was the ultimate cautionary tale about the hubris of the technological age. It was a stark drama of social class, where a steerage passenger was more than twice as likely to die as someone in first class. It was a gallery of heroes and villains, of steadfast love and quiet courage set against a backdrop of unimaginable terror. The world had been told the ship was a symbol of a new, safer, more civilized era. Its sinking, therefore, felt like a betrayal. A sign that the confident, orderly Edwardian world was perhaps not as secure as it believed. It was a wound in the collective psyche, a feeling that something fundamental had broken. And in just 2 years' time, that feeling would be borne out on a scale that would make the loss of the Titanic seem like a small, sad prelude. The world was about to sail into the far greater disaster of the First World War. The shadow of the Titanic fell long and dark over her two sister ships. The first of the trio, the RMS Olympic, was the Titanic's near-identical twin. She had been in service for almost a year when her sister sank. After the disaster, the Olympic was hastily recalled to the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast. She underwent a massive refit to correct the fatal design flaws revealed by the sinking. Her double bottom was extended up the sides of her hull. The watertight bulkheads were raised to extend all the way to the main B-deck, preventing the catastrophic spillover effect that had doomed the Titanic. And, most visibly, her boat deck was filled with a full complement of lifeboats, enough for every soul aboard. The changes made her a safer ship, but they could not erase the public's newfound anxiety. She became known as Old Reliable, a sturdy workhorse, rather than a glamorous queen of the seas. When the Great War erupted in 1914, the Olympic was requisitioned for the war effort. Her opulent interiors were stripped out, her grand windows boarded up, and she was painted in a dizzying coat of dazzled camouflage designed to confuse enemy U-boats. She became a troop ship, ferrying hundreds of thousands of Canadian and American soldiers to the battlefields of Europe. It was a dangerous duty. In 1918, in the English Channel, she spotted a German submarine, U-103, that was attempting to torpedo her. Instead of trying to evade, the Olympic's captain ordered the massive liner to turn and ram the submarine. The 46,000-ton ship sliced through the U-boat's hull, sinking it instantly. It was a remarkable act of aggression for a passenger liner and a moment of redemption for the Olympic-class design. The ship that was a twin to the one claimed by an act of nature had, through an act of war, become a hunter. After the war, she was refitted once more, returned to her former glory, and served as a popular transatlantic liner for another decade and a half. But by the 1930s, in the midst of the Great Depression and facing competition from newer, more modern vessels, her time was up. In 1935, the Old Reliable was sold for scrap. Her magnificent interiors, the oak paneling, the grand staircase, were auctioned off and can still be found in hotels and country houses across Britain, silent relics of a vanished age. The fate of the third and final sister, the HMHS Britannic, was even more directly tied to the great tragedies of the 20th century. Originally to be named the Gigantic, her name was quietly changed to the more modest Britannic after the Titanic's sinking. She was launched in 1914, incorporating all the post-Titanic safety improvements from the start. She was, without question, the safest of the three sisters, the culmination of all the lessons learned, but she would never carry a single paying passenger. Before her luxurious interior fittings could even be fully installed, the First World War began. She was immediately requisitioned by the British Admiralty and converted into a hospital ship. Her vast staterooms became hospital wards, her promenade decks spaces for the wounded, painted brilliant white with a broad green stripe and giant red crosses. Designed to ferry thousands of wounded soldiers home from the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in the Mediterranean. On the morning of November 21, 1916, steaming through the Kiei Channel in the Aegean Sea, the Britannic was rocked by a sudden, violent explosion. She had struck a German naval mine. The explosion tore a huge hole in her starboard bow, in almost the exact same area where the Titanic had been wounded. But the damage to the Britannic was far more severe. The watertight doors, which should have contained the flooding, had been opened to ventilate the ship's lower decks, and the force of the blast prevented them from being closed. Worse, Many of the nurses had opened the portholes on the lower decks to air out the wards against standing orders. As the ship began to list, these open portholes dipped below the waterline, allowing the sea to pour in unimpeded. The safest ship in the world was sinking, and she was sinking with terrifying speed. In just 55 minutes, the great ship rolled over onto her side and sank beneath the waves. The irony was profound, but the lessons of her sister had been learned. Thanks to the warmer water, the proximity to land, the daylight hours, and, most critically, the abundance of lifeboats, the loss of life was miraculously low. Of the 1,066 people on board, only 30 died. Most of them in 2 lifeboats that were launched prematurely and sucked into the still-turning propellers. The story of the Olympic-class liners was now complete. One had died by an act of nature, one by an act of war, and one had lived a long and faithful life, only to die by the scrapyard's torch. The grand dream, conceived in a London mansion, now lay scattered across the floor of 3 different seas. The sinking of the Titanic, which had so profoundly shocked the world, was soon to be overshadowed. The 1,500 lives lost seemed a horrifying number in 1912. By 1916, that number of men were being lost in a single morning's fighting on the Somme. The industrial-scale slaughter of the Great War recalibrated the world's understanding of tragedy. The Titanic disaster, once a symbol of unprecedented disaster, became a symbol of a lost age of innocence, a final dramatic flourish before the curtain rose on the brutal horror of the 20th century. Decades, the story of the Titanic lay dormant in the public consciousness, a well-known but distant historical event. Then, in 1955, an American writer and advertising man named Walter Lord published a book called A Night to Remember. Lord had been fascinated by the story since he was a boy. He spent years meticulously tracking down and interviewing more than 60 living survivors. He wove their personal testimonies together into a gripping minute-by-minute account of the sinking. The book was a sensation. It brought the human drama of the Titanic to life for a new generation, focusing not on the technical details, but on the experiences of the people themselves. It became a massive bestseller and was adapted into a highly acclaimed 1958 British film of the same name. Renowned for its historical accuracy and its understated documentary-style approach, the work of Walter Lord single-handedly revived the world's fascination with the Titanic. With this renewed interest came a new, audacious dream: to find the wreck. The ship lay somewhere in a 150-square-mile search area at a depth of over 2.5 miles. The pressure at that depth is nearly 6,000 pounds per square inch, a crushing force that would obliterate any conventional submarine. For years, the quest to find the Titanic was the ultimate challenge for deep-sea explorers, a technological Everest. Several expeditions, funded by ambitious Texas oilmen and driven by dreams of fame and fortune, tried and failed throughout the 1970s and early 80s. Some even harbored the fantastical notion of raising the entire ship, a feat that was, and remains, a physical impossibility. The Titanic remained a ghost, its exact location a secret held tight by the deep ocean. The man who would finally break the secret was Dr. Robert Ballard, an oceanographer from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Ballard was a visionary who had developed new technologies for deep-sea exploration. His secret weapon was a remotely operated vehicle named Argo, a submersible sled equipped with powerful sonar and video cameras, which could be towed above the seabed, sending images back to a control room on a surface ship. In the summer of 1985, Ballard was leading a joint French-American expedition. The mission was actually a covert operation for the U.S. Navy to map the wrecks of 2 sunken nuclear submarines, the USS Thresher and the USS Scorpion. The search for the Titanic was his secondary objective, a cover story for the classified mission. He was given only 12 days to find it. After weeks of fruitless searching, sweeping back and forth across the ocean floor, time was running out. The mood on the research vessel Nor was grim. Ballard changed his strategy. Instead of looking for the ship itself, he reasoned that the sinking ship would have left a long trail of debris as it plunged to the bottom. They should look for the breadcrumb trail. In the early morning hours of September 1, 1985, A watchkeeper in the control room noticed an unusual object on the video feed from Argo. It was a piece of wreckage, something clearly man-made. Then came another. And then a massive round object came into view. It was one of the Titanic's colossal boilers. A wave of hushed excitement went through the room. They had found the debris field. They were close. Following the trail, they scanned the dark, muddy abyss. And then it appeared. Out of the gloom, a wall of black steel rose from the seabed. The unmistakable form of a ship's bow, its railings still intact, loomed on the screen. It was the Titanic. There was no cheering in the control room, only a profound, reverent silence. They were looking at a tomb. Ballard would later describe the feeling as one of awe and deep sadness. The great ship was no longer a myth. It was real, and it was a haunting, ghostly presence, resting upright on the ocean floor, a monument to all the souls it had taken with it. The discovery was a global media event. The first images of the wreck, ghostly and beautiful, captivated the world. Ballard's initial expedition treated the site with immense respect. He refused to land his submersible on the decks, viewing it as a desecration of a gravesite. He left a plaque on the stern, dedicating the wreck as a memorial and urging that it be left in peace. But the discovery had let the genie out of the bottle. Now that the world knew where the Titanic was, it was inevitable that others would follow, and not all of them would share Ballard's reverence. A fierce debate erupted, a battle for the soul of the Titanic. On one side were those like Ballard who believed the wreck was a sacred memorial and should be left undisturbed. On the other side were commercial salvage operators who saw the wreck as a treasure trove of historical artifacts that could be recovered, preserved, and exhibited to the public. The company RMS Titanic Inc. eventually won exclusive salvage rights in a U.S. court beginning in 1987. A series of expeditions descended to the wreck, using submersibles equipped with robotic arms to retrieve thousands of objects from the debris field surrounding the two main sections of the hull. They brought up everything from fine china dinner plates and unopened bottles of champagne to personal items. A leather satchel containing a traveler's documents, a pair of spectacles, a child's toy. The salvagers argued that they were saving these artifacts from certain destruction. The deep ocean is not a static environment. Microscopic organisms, metal-eating bacteria, are slowly consuming the ship. These colonies, which hang like rusty icicles from the hull, have been dubbed rusticles, and they are turning the ship's steel into a fine powder. The salvagers argued that by bringing these items to the surface, they were preserving the legacy of the Titanic for future generations. They mounted spectacular traveling exhibitions allowing millions of people around the world to come face to face with the tangible relics of the lost ship. For many visitors, seeing a pair of worn leather shoes or a handwritten letter made the century-old tragedy feel immediate and deeply personal. But for many others, including some survivors' descendants, these exhibitions were a form of ghoulish entertainment, a desecration of a mass grave. The debate continues to this day, a complex ethical question with no easy answer. Is the wreck a museum to be curated or a cemetery to be respected? Does the public's right to see these artifacts outweigh the sanctity of the site as a final resting place? While the human debate rages on the surface, the ship itself continues its slow, inexorable return to nature. The relentless pressure and the ceaseless activity of the rusticles are taking their toll. The wreck is collapsing. The iconic crow's nest on the forward mast, from which Frederick Fleet first shouted "Iceberg right ahead," has broken off and vanished. The gymnasium roof has caved in. Captain's cabin has dissolved. Scientists who monitored the wreck predict that, within the next few decades, the hull will collapse completely, leaving nothing but a large, rust-colored stain and a field of debris on the ocean floor. The physical presence of the great ship is fading, its ghost slowly dissolving into the deep.
Ow.
The final living link to the disaster was severed in May of 2009, with the death of Milvina Dean at the age of 97. She had been the youngest passenger on board. Just 2 months old when she was bundled into a sack and lowered into a lifeboat, her passing marked a turning point. The story of the Titanic now belongs completely to history. Oh, the documents, the artifacts, and the enduring power of its myth. So what is the final legacy of this ship of dreams? It is a story of layers, On the surface, it is about the birth of a new era of safety, of lessons learned that have saved countless lives at sea. Deeper down, it is a perfect time capsule of a bygone age, a snapshot of the rigid class structure, the boundless optimism, and the fatal hubris of the Edwardian era on the very eve of its destruction. But at its core, in the silent, beating heart of the legend, it is a story about people. It is the story of John and Madeline Astor's scandalous love and Isidore and Ida Strauss's unbreakable devotion. It is the story of Margaret Brown's fiery resilience and Captain Smith's stoic sacrifice. It is the story of the Navratil orphans, the Sage family's lost American dream, and the silent, heroic engineers who kept the lights on. It is a story that encompasses the very best and the very worst of humanity when faced with the ultimate test. It is a story of how we live, how we love, and how we die. The great ship itself may be vanishing, consumed by the dark, cold, and eternal sea, but its story is truly unsinkable. It has become a part of us, a permanent fixture in our collective imagination, a cautionary tale, and a timeless epic. It is the story of the RMS Titanic, a ship that, in its single voyage, sailed from the height of human ambition to the depths of the ocean, and in doing so, achieved a kind of immortality it was never designed for. Its voyage is over, but its journey, in our minds and in our culture, will go on forever.